This is Break It Down to the T, where we don't just review films, we diagnose them. Think of us as the shrinks Hollywood never hired. Welcome to the couch. Okay, so Christopher Nolan's Odyssey just hit theaters and everybody and their mother is doing a breakdown video right now. Half of them are going to tell you it's about war. The other half are going to tell you it's about coming home. And sure, fine, that's the poster version. But here's what nobody's saying. This movie has 7 main characters walking around with 7 actual diagnosable conditions. And Nolan just never says it out loud. He doesn't have to. It's all right there in the blocking, in the dialogue choices, in one single word a grown man uses to describe his own father. So today we're not doing one diagnosis. We're doing the whole family. Odysseus, Penelope, Telemachus, Antinous, Circe, Helen, Eumaeus. 7 patients, 7 charts, 1 house that's basically a group therapy session that never got scheduled. Get comfortable. This is gonna get messy before it gets clear. Let's start where we should have started. Patient 1, Odysseus, played by Matt Damon. And here's the take. This isn't Damon's first rodeo playing a soldier who can't remember or can't face what war did to him. Nolan's basically weaponizing Damon's whole career here because audiences already trust this guy. They already went through amnesia and violence with him once in the Bourne movies, and Nolan is banking on that trust to make you comfortable enough to sit through something a lot heavier this time. Except now, there's no espionage plot to hide behind. It's just a man, a body, and a mind that's been quietly breaking for years before the movie even opens. The scene reference is the opening itself. We meet Odysseus, not mid-battle, not mid-journey, but tucked away on Calypso's island, kept in a kind of lotus-induced stupor for 7 years, because on some level, someone around him has clocked that he isn't ready to face what happened at Troy. That's not a framing device. That's a diagnosis sitting right there in the first act. A man being medicated into forgetting because reality is too much to metabolize is, clinically, about as clean a picture of avoidance as complex trauma gets. And when the fog finally lifts and the memories start coming back, they don't come back in order, and they don't come back gently. They come back in fragments, stacked on top of each other. War, then shipwreck, then loss, then war again. Because that's how compounding trauma actually surfaces. Not as one wound, as a pile. Here's the why. Because you should never just take my word for a diagnosis without the receipts. Reviewers have already pointed out that one specific memory functions as Odysseus' true haunting. Not the war itself, not the years at sea, but the death of one woman during the sack of Troy, whose face he sees every time he calls on the gods for help. That's a textbook trauma anchor. A complex trauma patient doesn't get haunted by the whole war as an abstract concept. They get haunted by one image that the brain never processed properly, that keeps resurfacing uninvited, out of order, louder than everything else that happened around it. Nolan didn't need a therapist character to diagnose Odysseus on screen. He just needed to show you which memory won't let go, and let the audience do the rest of the math. And that's the tragedy under the sword fights and the sea monsters. Odysseus isn't a hero slowly finding his way home. He's a man whose nervous system never got a single break long enough to file away one trauma before the next one landed on top of it, kept sedated for years because even the people who loved him could see he wasn't ready, and then thrown right back into the fire the second he woke up. That's not an adventure story. That's what complex PTSD looks like when nobody around you has the language to name it. Patient 2, Penelope, played by Anne Hathaway. And here's the hook. Hathaway herself pushed back on the lazy reading of this character before the movie even came out. She said flat out that she never saw Penelope as passively, quietly waiting, that she played her as an active, ride-or-die partner instead. And I actually think Hathaway's right, but not in the way she probably meant it. Because not passive doesn't mean not suffering. It means the suffering just doesn't look like what we're used to seeing on screen. It looks like motion. It looks like a woman doing something with her hands every single night for years, because sitting still with the not knowing would be so much worse. The scene reference is the loom, obviously, but it's not the weaving that gives the diagnosis away. It's the unraveling. Penelope tells the suitors she's finishing a burial shroud before she'll choose a husband, and every night she quietly undoes the work she did that day. Everyone treats this as a strategy, a clever stall tactic, outsmarting men who underestimate her. Sure, on the surface. But watch what the ritual actually is. Building something and then destroying it, on loop, with no finish line in sight, because there genuinely isn't one. She doesn't know if Odysseus is alive. Nobody's confirmed a death. There's no funeral to attend, no body to bury, no moment where grief gets to officially start and eventually end. That's the exact clinical definition of ambiguous loss, and her hands are performing it every single night, whether she consciously frames it that way or not. Here's the why. Because Hathaway's own words actually hand you the proof without meaning to. She specifically says Penelope's loyalty doesn't come from duty or obligation, it comes from loving Odysseus with her, quote, whole fiery soul. That's important, because ambiguous loss hits so much harder in people with real, deep attachment. It's not a formality being upheld. It's a nervous system that's still fully bonded to someone who might not exist to come back to anymore. And that bond doesn't get the courtesy of an ending. Nolan reportedly leaned into how misunderstood Penelope feels even by the people around her, which tracks perfectly, because ambiguous loss is often invisible from the outside. Everyone just sees patient wife. Nobody sees the woman quietly unmaking her own work at 2 a.m. because her body can't stop rehearsing an unresolved goodbye. And that's the gut punch under all the pseudo-politics and palace intrigue. Penelope's not clever because she's playing games with men who want her crown. She's clever because that's the only language available to a person the myth refuses to let grieve properly. Every night, she builds hope during the day and dismantles it in the dark, and that cycle isn't romance. It's a woman trapped in the most human, most exhausting form of unfinished mourning there is. Patient 3, Telemachus, played by Tom Holland. And here's the hook. There was an actual online controversy over one single word in this movie. People got mad, genuinely mad, that Telemachus calls his father dad instead of father in the trailer, like it broke some sacred ancient Greek formality. Holland himself had to go on Channel 4 News and defend it, joking that technically he wouldn't have said either word since he'd have been speaking Greek. Funny deflection. But here's the thing. The internet accidentally proved my whole diagnosis by getting mad about it in the first place. Nobody starts a controversy over a throwaway line. They start it because something about that word landed wrong. And the reason it lands wrong is because it's supposed to. The scene reference is that same line. But zoom out to what Holland himself said about the character off camera. He's described Telemachus as someone who was so young when his father left for Troy that he doesn't actually remember him, and everything he knows about Odysseus comes secondhand through the already mythical stories other people tell. Holland put it plainly. He's playing a young man of about 20 who spent his whole life searching for an absent father he's put on a pedestal. That's not a throwaway quote. That's the clinical picture, straight from the actor's own mouth, without him even framing it that way. Here's the why. Because dad versus father is exactly the linguistic tell you'd expect from this profile. Identity develops through real relationship, actual friction, actual presence, a person to push against and learn from directly. Telemachus never got that. He got a pedestal instead of a parent. And when your entire relationship with someone freezes at whatever age you last had them, the language freezes too. A man who grew up alongside his father graduates to father, to something more formal, more adult, because the relationship itself matured. Telemachus never got that upgrade. He stuck calling him dad the same way a much younger kid would, because emotionally, that's the last real update he ever received. Everything since then has been myth, not relationship, and myth doesn't teach you how to grow a bond. It just teaches you how to admire one from a distance. And that's what makes this such a quiet, devastating diagnosis compared to Odysseus and Penelope's louder ones. Telemachus isn't screaming, isn't unraveling anything at a loom, isn't flinching at triggers. He's just a 20-year-old man performing a relationship he's never actually had, using the vocabulary of a child because that's the only version of father his identity ever got to keep. The internet fought about the word for a week without realizing they'd stumbled onto the exact wound the character's been carrying the whole movie. He's not disrespecting the epic by saying dad. He's telling you, in one syllable, exactly how far his development got before the story of his father took over where the actual man should have been. Patient 4, Antinous, played by Robert Pattinson. And here's the hook. Pattinson himself has been going around press junkets calling this character's whole plot a love story, not a scheme, not a hostile takeover of another man's wife, throne, and kid. A love story. He said flat out he doesn't think Antinous is really the bad guy, that Penelope's just waiting for him to get older, charming, self-deprecating, funny in interviews. And that's exactly the tell, because malignant narcissists don't experience themselves as villains either. They experience themselves as the misunderstood romantic lead of their own story. And Pattinson, probably without meaning to, is doing method press for the diagnosis before the movie even gets a chance to show it to you. The scene reference lives in what the plot actually has Antinous doing while he's busy being charming in interviews, which is scheming to marry Penelope, take Odysseus' throne, and, per the character's actual arc, moving to eliminate Telemachus as a threat to that plan. That's not romantic rivalry. That's a man positioning himself to inherit a life that isn't his by removing the people standing between him and it, while performing warmth the entire time. Pattinson even said in his own prep he pulled from James Woods' character in Casino, someone he described as a little sleazy for the tone. That's a specific choice. Sleazy charm isn't menace. It's seduction as strategy, charisma deployed with precision, never accidental. Here's the why. Malignant narcissism isn't just arrogance. It's a specific combination: grandiosity, charm used instrumentally, and a total absence of guilt about who gets hurt along the way. Antinous checks every box without the film needing a single line of exposition. He's glamorous on purpose. Pattinson worked with costuming specifically to make him look wealthy and privileged, right down to the underwear, because malignant narcissists perform status as armor. He's charming to Penelope while working an angle against her son. And the real giveaway, Pattinson himself, half joking, called the character the worst stepfather you could possibly have. That's not an insult from an outside critic.
And that's what makes Antinous the scariest patient on this list, honestly, because he doesn't read as sick the way Odysseus or Penelope do. He reads as fun, as the guy at the party everyone's laughing with. Pattinson's own framing proves it. A love story, a bit of harmless competition, nothing to see here. That's the actual danger of malignant narcissism in real life, too. It rarely announces itself as cruelty. It shows up smiling, calling itself charming, calling itself misunderstood, right up until you notice everyone standing between it and what it wants keeps quietly disappearing. Patient 5, Circe, played by Charlize Theron. And here's the hook. A woman who turns men into pigs is usually treated as one of the easiest villains in this entire story. She lives alone, men enter her space, she strips them of their humanity and reduces them to animals. Case closed. Evil witch. Except Nolan doesn't frame the transformation like random cruelty. He frames it like a system. Circe doesn't lash out in chaos. She watches, evaluates, and then takes control. And that distinction matters, because uncontrolled rage is an emotional explosion. Circe's behavior is the opposite. It's trauma-driven control-seeking, the kind that develops when someone has learned that safety only exists when every unpredictable person around them has been made completely manageable. The scene reference is Odysseus entering her home after his men have already been transformed. Circe isn't startled by him. She isn't improvising. Everything about the space feels prepared, almost ritualistic, as if this encounter has happened in different forms many times before. The food, the hospitality, the calmness, even the transformation itself. It's all controlled down to the smallest movement. That's what makes the scene so unsettling. She isn't defending herself in the moment. She's built an entire environment where nobody else gets enough power to become a threat in the first place. And look at what she actually transforms the men into. Not monsters, not corpses, pigs. Creatures that can still move, still make noise, still consume, but no longer possess language, weapons, or social authority. She doesn't remove them from her world. She removes their ability to influence it. That's not destruction for the sake of destruction. That's control, taken to its most psychologically revealing extreme. Here's the why. Because trauma-driven control-seeking usually begins with an earlier experience of helplessness. When a person has once been trapped in a situation where someone else had total power over their body, their safety, or their choices, the nervous system can start treating unpredictability itself as danger. The response becomes simple. Control the room before the room can control you. Circe's magic allows her to make that coping mechanism literal. Every man becomes smaller. Every threat becomes containable. Every interaction ends with her holding all the power that she believes someone else will eventually use against her. And that's the tragedy underneath all the magic. Circe has reclaimed so much power that there's no room left for trust. She can protect herself from being wronged again, but only by making genuine intimacy impossible. Turning men into pigs isn't just punishment, it's prevention. Circe isn't saying every man is an animal. She's saying every man becomes safer once she takes away his ability to hurt her. Patient 6, Helen of Troy, played by Lupita Nyong'o. And here's the hook. Imagine being blamed for a war before anyone bothers to ask who you are outside of it. Not what you wanted, not what happened to you, not whether you chose any of this. Just one identity, assigned early and repeated so often that eventually the entire world forgets there was ever a person underneath it. Helen doesn't walk into this story as a woman. She walks into it as an explanation. The face that launched 1,000 ships. The beauty that destroyed Troy. A symbol everybody recognizes and almost nobody actually knows. And psychologically, there's a term for what happened to her long before the first soldier arrived. Identity foreclosure. The scene reference is the moment Helen is surrounded by the aftermath of Troy, while the men around her argue over what her beauty caused. Listen to the language. They don't speak to her as if she survived the war. They speak about her as if she is the war. Her face becomes evidence. Her body becomes territory. Her existence becomes the clean, convenient answer to a catastrophe built by kings, pride, alliances, and thousands of armed men making deliberate choices. Helen barely needs to speak for the scene to diagnose her, because everybody else has already decided what her story means. Here's the why. Because identity foreclosure is a real developmental psychology term. It describes what happens when a person commits to, or is trapped inside, an identity before getting the space to explore alternatives for themselves. Usually we talk about it in terms of family expectations, religion, career, or social roles. But Helen's version is brutal, because her identity wasn't only assigned by the people closest to her, it was assigned by history. She never got to become Helen before she became Helen of Troy, and that of Troy does all the damage. It attaches her permanently to a place that burned, a conflict she supposedly caused, and a mythology that needs her beauty to be powerful enough to explain mass destruction. She can't age out of it. She can't correct it. She can't introduce a more complicated version of herself because the simpler version is too useful to everyone else. Men get to be warriors, strategists, kings, husbands, survivors. Helen gets to be a face. That's why Lupita Nyong'o's stillness matters here. Helen doesn't need to perform distress loudly, because identity foreclosure often looks like compliance from the outside. When every room reflects the same version of you back at yourself, resistance starts to feel pointless. You learn which expression people expect. You learn when silence is safer than contradiction. Eventually, the assigned identity becomes a kind of social prison with no visible walls, because everyone insists it's a privilege. She is admired, desired, remembered, and none of those things require her to be understood. And that's the tragedy underneath the legend. Helen may be the most famous woman in the story, but fame has erased her more completely than anonymity ever could. The world immortalized her face and foreclosed the person behind it. She didn't lose her identity during the war. She was never given enough freedom to build one before everyone else decided who she would be. Patient 6, Helen of Troy, played by Lupita Nyong'o. And here's the hook. Imagine being blamed for a war before anyone bothers to ask who you are outside of it. Not what you wanted, not what happened to you, not whether you chose any of this. Just one identity, assigned early and repeated so often that eventually the entire world forgets there was ever a person underneath it. Helen doesn't walk into this story as a woman. She walks into it as an explanation. The face that launched 1,000 ships. The beauty that destroyed Troy. A symbol everybody recognizes and almost nobody actually knows. And psychologically, there's a term for what happened to her long before the first soldier arrived. Identity foreclosure. The scene reference is the moment Helen is surrounded by the aftermath of Troy, while the men around her argue over what her beauty caused. Listen to the language. They don't speak to her as if she survived the war. They speak about her as if she is the war. Her face becomes evidence. Her body becomes territory. Her existence becomes the clean, convenient answer to a catastrophe built by kings, pride, alliances, and thousands of armed men making deliberate choices. Helen barely needs to speak for the scene to diagnose her, because everybody else has already decided what her story means. Here's the why. Because identity foreclosure is a real developmental psychology term. It describes what happens when a person commits to, or is trapped inside, an identity before getting the space to explore alternatives for themselves. Usually we talk about it in terms of family expectations, religion, career, or social roles. But Helen's version is brutal, because her identity wasn't only assigned by the people closest to her, it was assigned by history. She never got to become Helen before she became Helen of Troy. And that of Troy does all the damage. It attaches her permanently to a place that burned, a conflict she supposedly caused, and a mythology that needs her beauty to be powerful enough to explain mass destruction. She can't age out of it. She can't correct it. She can't introduce a more complicated version of herself, because the simpler version is too useful to everyone else. Men get to be warriors, strategists, kings, husbands, survivors. Helen gets to be a face. That's why Lupita Nyong'o's stillness matters here. Helen doesn't need to perform distress loudly, because identity foreclosure often looks like compliance from the outside. When every room reflects the same version of you back at yourself, resistance starts to feel pointless. You learn which expression people expect. You learn when silence is safer than contradiction. Eventually, the assigned identity becomes a kind of social prison with no visible walls, because everyone insists it's a privilege. She is admired, desired, remembered, and none of those things require her to be understood. And that's the tragedy underneath the legend. Helen may be the most famous woman in the story, but fame has erased her more completely than anonymity ever could. The world immortalized her face and foreclosed the person behind it. She didn't lose her identity during the war. She was never given enough freedom to build one before everyone else decided who she would be. Eumaeus, John Leguizamo. Codependency, the loyal servant whose entire self-worth is built around being needed by someone else. Loyalty past the point of self-preservation. Classic self-erasure through service. Patient 7, Eumaeus, played by John Leguizamo. And here's the hook. Loyalty is one of those traits movies almost never question. A servant waits 20 years for his king, protects his household, helps his son, and remains faithful while everybody else assumes Odysseus is dead. We're supposed to look at Eumaeus and think, good man, noble man, the one person who never abandoned his duty. And he is all of those things. But loyalty stops being a virtue when a person no longer exists outside of it. Eumaeus hasn't simply dedicated his life to Odysseus. He's built his entire sense of worth around being useful to a man who hasn't needed him for 20 years. That's not just devotion. That's codependency dressed up as service. The scene reference is Odysseus returning to Ithaca in disguise and seeking shelter in Eumaeus' home. Eumaeus doesn't recognize the man standing in front of him, but he still talks about Odysseus as if his own life paused the day the king disappeared. The palace has been invaded. The household has changed. Telemachus has grown into a man. Eumaeus himself has aged. But emotionally, he's still maintaining the same position, waiting for the person who gave that position meaning to come back and validate all the years he sacrificed protecting it. And watch how quickly he serves the stranger. Food, shelter, information, protection. He doesn't know whether this man deserves any of it. He only knows someone needs something, and needing him is enough to activate the identity he understands best. Eumaeus doesn't ask, who is this person to me? He asks, what can I do for him? That sounds generous, until you realize he applies the question to everyone, except himself. Here's the why. Because codependency isn't simply caring too much. It's when your self-esteem becomes dependent on being needed, rescuing others, or keeping someone else's life functioning at the expense of your own. The codependent person often looks incredibly reliable from the outside. They're the helper, the loyal one, the person who never leaves. What nobody asks is whether they remain because they freely choose the relationship, or because walking away would force them to confront the terrifying possibility that they have no identity without it. Eumaeus' loyalty has already crossed the point of self-preservation. He remains connected to a household being consumed by violent, entitled men. He protects Telemachus, even when doing so places him in danger. And the second Odysseus reveals himself, Eumaeus is ready to enter the conflict without negotiating what it might cost him. He doesn't require safety, recognition, or an equal place in the plan. Being useful again is the reward. That's what makes Leguizamo such an interesting choice, because he can make Eumaeus' service feel warm, energetic, even loving. There's no obvious resentment in it. But codependency doesn't always feel like captivity to the person living inside it. Sometimes it feels like purpose. Sometimes self-erasure feels noble because everybody around you keeps praising how much you're willing to give. And that's the whole family. 7 characters, 7 conditions, and one epic that starts looking a lot less like a heroic adventure once you put everybody on the couch. Odysseus is carrying complex trauma he never had time to process. Penelope is trapped inside ambiguous loss. Telemachus built his identity around a father he never knew. Antinous turns entitlement into a love story. Circe manufactures safety through control. Helen lives inside an identity the world assigned her. And Eumaeus erases himself through service, because being needed is the only proof he has that he matters. None of this makes them weak, and it doesn't reduce them to a diagnosis either. It explains why every relationship in this story feels so painfully human, despite the gods, monsters, magic, and mythology surrounding it. Nobody here is simply trying to get home. They're trying to return to versions of themselves that may not exist anymore. And maybe that's Nolan's real trick. The Odyssey isn't about whether Odysseus can survive the journey back to Ithaca. It's about whether anybody can truly come home after trauma has changed the person who left. But I want to hear your diagnosis. Which character do you think is the most psychologically damaged? And which one did I completely misread? Let me know in the comments. This has been Break It Down to the T, where we don't just review films, we diagnose them. Until the next session, the couch is officially closed.